called me on a Tuesday morning to ask if I'd had enough time to think. 12 years. That's how long I'd given Maplewood Elementary. 12 years of arriving before the custodians, leaving after the security lights kicked on, spending my own money on pencils and construction paper and those little individual hand sanitizer bottles because the district budget never stretched far enough. 12 years of parent-teacher conferences where I memorized not just the kids' names, but their situations. Who had a new baby at home, who was going through a divorce, whose dad had just lost his job. I knew these families. I was part of these families. And then, on the Thursday afternoon in October, Principal Hartley called me into his office and told me I was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The accusation? That I had been manipulating my students' standardized test scores. I remember the exact way the afternoon light came through his office window. One of those low October suns that makes everything look amber and quiet. I remember staring at the framed photo of his daughter on his desk and thinking, this isn't happening. I had spent a decade and a half teaching other people's children to read. I had never once, not once, touched a bubble sheet that wasn't my own. He couldn't look me in the eye when he said it. I found out later that the complaint had been filed by a parent. Not just any parent. The mother of Tyler Baines, a third grader I'd held back the previous year because his reading level was still 18 months behind grade. She had been furious. She'd told me at the time that I was sabotaging her son's future. I tried to explain that holding him back was protecting his future, that sending him to 4th grade without the foundational skills he needed would only make things harder. She'd smiled tightly and left my classroom without another word. What I didn't know then was that her husband sat on the district's school board. I drove home that Thursday in a kind of dissociated haze. My hands were on the wheel. The radio was on. I have no memory of what was playing. I walked into my house, sat down on the kitchen floor. Not a chair, the actual floor, and stayed there for a long time. My mother called that evening. I didn't tell her. I said I was tired, that it had been a long week. She asked if I was eating enough. I said yes. We talked for 11 minutes about whether her neighbor's new dog was bothering the birds at her feeder. I hung up and cried until I couldn't breathe. The Tuesday morning call, 3 days after my leave was announced, was from the district's HR coordinator, a man I'd met exactly twice. He said the investigation was proceeding efficiently. He said I should use this time to reflect. He used the phrase for the benefit of all parties involved 4 times in a 6-minute conversation. I asked him directly who filed the complaint. He said he couldn't disclose that. I already knew, but I needed to understand how. How a parent's anger could translate into a formal investigation. How a conversation I'd had in my own classroom, explaining a decision I'd made in the best interest of a child, had somehow become evidence of misconduct. So I started digging. I want to be clear about something. When I say I started digging, I don't mean I went looking for revenge. I'm not that kind of person. Or maybe I am, in certain circumstances, but that's not where I was at in those first few days. I was terrified. I had a mortgage. I had a car payment. I had a mother with early-stage osteoporosis who I helped with grocery runs twice a week. My salary was not optional. What I was actually looking for was the truth. And sometimes the truth, when you find it, turns out to be a lot bigger and a lot uglier than you expected. The test score manipulation allegations specifically claimed that I had altered bubble sheets on the state assessments administered the previous spring. The district had apparently cross-referenced some anomalies in the data, a cluster of my students showing unusual gains in certain skill areas, and decided that was suspicious. A testing irregularity flag had been generated by the state's automated system. Here's what I knew. Those gains were real. I had spent the better part of that school year running a small group intervention program every morning from 7:15 to 7:55 before the first bell, working specifically on the phonics and decoding skills that the state test assessed heavily. 7 kids, mostly boys, mostly from homes where English was the second language. We met every single morning. I documented every session in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer. That notebook had been collected when I was placed on leave. I called my union rep the morning after the HR call. Her name is Diane, and she has been doing this work for 23 years, and she speaks in the calm, measured cadence of someone who has seen every version of every bad situation that a school district can produce. She listened to everything I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you have copies of your session documentation?" she asked. I did. I had started photographing the notebook pages on my phone every Friday as a habit, not because I anticipated anything like this, but because I am, by nature, someone who backs things up. It's a teacher habit. You learn to create paper trails because at some point a parent will tell you they never received the field trip permission slip you definitely sent home 3 times. I emailed those photos to Diane that afternoon, 47 pages. "Good," she said when she confirmed receipt. "Don't talk to anyone at the district without me present, and don't post anything about this online. Anything." I didn't. I waited. What I did do in the evenings was research. I spent 3 nights reading through the state's testing administration protocols, the district's own assessment policies, and every publicly available document related to testing irregularity investigations I could find. I am a 3rd-grade teacher, not a lawyer, but I had spent 12 years teaching children to read carefully, to look for evidence, to ask "how do you know that?" before accepting something as true. The state's irregularity flag was generated by an algorithm. It identified statistical outliers. It was not, itself, evidence of fraud. It was a flag, a prompt for human review. The question was whether the human review had actually happened, or whether someone had simply used the algorithmic flag as justification to act. I sent Diane a 3-page summary of what I'd found. She called me the next morning. "I need you to know something," she said. "I've been doing this a long time, and most of the time when a teacher gets flagged, there's a bureaucratic explanation. Someone mishandled something. Something got miscommunicated. But what you're describing has a different shape to it." She told me she'd made some calls. The formal complaint from Tyler's mother had been filed not through the standard parent grievance process, but through a direct communication to the board, specifically to one board member. It had bypassed the principal's office entirely, which was irregular. It had also been filed the same week the district was conducting its annual performance review of school staff, the window during which administrative leave decisions could be processed most quickly. Somebody knew the timing. I sat with that information for a long time. The thing about being wrongly accused of something is that it changes the way you experience time. The days don't move the way they normally do. You wake up, and the first thing that exists in your consciousness is the accusation. It's there before the alarm, before the light, before you remember what day it is. It sits on your chest. I had stopped sleeping through the night by the end of the first week. I was up at 3 a.m. every morning with my laptop open on the kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold beside me, reading things I'd already read twice. My husband noticed. Of course he noticed. We'd been married 9 years, and he knows the difference between my normal nighttime restlessness and the specific, focused insomnia of a person trying to solve something. "You need to let Diane handle this," he said one night, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. "Diane can't read the documentation I'm reading," I said. "You're a 3rd-grade teacher, not an investigator." "I was a 3rd-grade teacher," I said, and then I heard myself say it and had to stop. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He didn't say anything else. He understood. "My daughter called from college that weekend. She's studying pre-law at Ohio State, and she had heard from my husband what was happening. She was furious in the way that 20-year-olds are furious, loudly, immediately, without any of the tactical caution that I was trying to exercise. "Mom, this is defamation," she said. "This is literally defamation." "It might be," I said, "but I need to understand the full picture first." "You keep saying that. The full picture. What does that mean?" What it meant was this. I had found something. In my research through publicly available district documents, I had come across the performance data for every elementary school in the district over the past 4 years. Not individual student data, aggregate school-level data, published annually as part of the state's accountability reporting. I had been looking specifically at testing irregularity rates across schools when I noticed something in the numbers for Ridgeview Elementary. Ridgeview was the other third-grade feeder school in our district. Its test score gains in the same assessment cycle that had flagged my class were more dramatic than mine, significantly more dramatic. My students had shown an average improvement of 11 percentile points. Ridgeview's third graders had improved by 22 points in the same period. Ridgeview had not been flagged. The third-grade teacher at Ridgeview at the time was a woman named Beverly Calloway. She was, as I learned from the district's public staff directory, the sister-in-law of the board member whose office had received Tyler's mother's complaint. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not going to tell you that I felt triumphant when I found it. I didn't. I felt sick. I felt the particular nausea of realizing that the system you had trusted for 12 years had a rot in it that had nothing to do with the children and everything to do with the adults. I called Diane at 7:30 on a Monday morning. She picked up on the second ring. I walked her through everything I'd found. She was quiet for most of it. When I finished, she said, "Send me everything. Everything you have tonight." I did. What happened next took 4 weeks. I know that sounds fast, and in some ways, it was. Diane later told me she'd been wanting to examine Ridgeview's data for 2 years, but had never had a direct comparison point strong enough to open a formal inquiry. What I'd given her was that comparison point. The state's Department of Education has an Office of Assessment Integrity. I had read about it in my research but assumed it was largely theoretical, one of those oversight bodies that exists on paper more than in practice. I was wrong. Once Diane filed a formal request for review, citing specific statistical anomalies and the procedural irregularities and how my complaint had been initiated, the office opened an inquiry. Not just into my situation, into the district's testing administration practices over a 4-year period. I was not in the room for any of it. I was home, teaching my daughter's old cat to tolerate me in the mornings, trying to sleep, waiting. My husband made dinner every night for 6 weeks. He didn't ask me to update him unless I wanted to. He drove me to my doctor's appointment when the insomnia got bad enough that I needed to talk to someone, and he waited in the parking lot for an hour and 20 minutes without a word of complaint. I want to say that for the record, because I think sometimes in these stories, the people who hold things together quietly get left out. The inquiry found what I had suspected. Beverly Calloway had not been the only educator involved, but she was the most direct beneficiary of a scoring process that had been improperly supervised across multiple testing cycles at Ridgeview. The board member, Tyler's mother's contact, had used his position to suppress internal concerns about Ridgeview's data twice in the previous 3 years, while simultaneously providing the procedural mechanism for Tyler's mother's complaint against me to be escalated to leave status without standard review. In plain language, he had protected one teacher who was cheating and helped railroad another teacher who wasn't. The formal findings were released 6 weeks after Diane filed the initial inquiry. My leave was rescinded. The investigation against me was closed with no findings. The district issued a statement. It used the phrase administrative error 4 times and the word regret once in a subordinate clause. I was asked to return to work the following Monday. I thought about what I was going to say on the drive-in. I practiced different versions of it: dignified, professional, brief. I had rehearsed a version that was generous, that acknowledged the difficulty of the district's position, that moved forward without dragging things back. I walked into the main office, and the school secretary, a woman who had covered for me during 2 maternity leaves over the years, who knew my lunch order, who had sent me a card when my dog died 3 years ago, she stood up and hugged me in the middle of the room. I did not say any of my rehearsed versions. I cried. She cried. 2 other office staff came in and stood in the doorway, and nobody said anything professional or measured for about 4 minutes. Principal Hartley came out of his office. He looked like a man who had not slept well in 6 weeks. He said my name, and then he didn't seem to know what to say after that. "I know," I said. And I meant it. I'm not sure I've completely forgiven him, but I understand that he was also operating inside a system that had misled him, and the anger I feel toward him is smaller and quieter than the anger I feel toward the board member who had engineered the whole thing. The board member resigned the week after the state's findings were released. It was framed in the local paper as a personal decision. I read the article 3 times looking for the word accountability and did not find it. Beverly Calloway was placed on leave at Ridgeview. As of the following spring, she had not returned. Tyler Baines, the little boy at the center of all of it, the child whose mother's fury had started this whole thing. He was in my class again that January. His mother had requested a transfer to a different school in the district, and the district had declined, citing capacity. I don't know what his mother felt about that. I know what I felt. I was going to teach that kid to read if it took the rest of the school year. By spring, he was reading at grade level. Just barely, but there. I want to be honest about something, because I think these stories have a tendency to clean up in the ending, to sand down the jagged parts. The truth is that I'm still angry sometimes. I'm angry in a low-level, persistent way, the kind of anger that lives in your body rather than your thoughts. I'll be standing in line at the grocery store and I'll think about those 6 weeks, about the insomnia, about sitting on my kitchen floor, and the anger will come back like a muscle memory. I also know that I am one of the lucky ones. I had a union rep. I had documentation. I had a husband who made dinner. I had a daughter who called and yelled on my behalf when I was trying to stay calm. Most teachers who get caught in something like this don't have all of those things, and the outcomes are different. What I would tell anyone in a version of my situation: document everything, always. Not because you're expecting to need it. Because the moment you need it and don't have it is not the moment you want to discover that lesson. On the last day of school that year, my students made me a card. 31 names inside it, in the handwriting of children who had spent a year learning how letters fit together to make meaning. Tyler's name was near the bottom, in blue crayon, with a small star drawn next to it that might have been a sun. I have that card in my desk drawer. Some mornings, when I get in before everyone else and the building is still quiet and the low light is just coming through the windows, I take it out and look at it. Not because it fixes anything, not because it makes the whole thing okay. Just because it reminds me what the 12 years were actually for. I keep coming back to the moment I sat down on my kitchen floor. Not a chair, the floor. There's something about that detail that still stays with me. Because I think that's where you end up when the thing that happens to you is too big to process upright. The floor is honest. You can't pretend you're holding it together when you're sitting on linoleum at 9 o'clock at night with your coat still on. What I've learned, not from a book, not from a podcast, but from those 6 weeks, is that there are really only 3 things that determine whether you survive something like that. And I don't mean survive in a dramatic sense. I mean whether you come out of it still recognizable to yourself. The first is integrity, not the words you put on a resume, the actual thing, the kind that exists in small, unsexy habits. I had photographed 47 pages of a notebook every Friday for years, not because I was expecting a fight, because I believed that what I did in that classroom was worth documenting. That habit, that quiet insistence on keeping a record of my own work, turned out to be the only thing standing between me and a false accusation with no rebuttal. Integrity isn't a feeling. It's a practice. It lives in what you do when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. The second is clarity. When Diane told me the complaint had bypassed the standard grievance process, I had 2 choices. I could collapse into the unfairness of it. And believe me, part of me wanted to, or I could get specific. What exactly happened? When? Through whose office? Why does Ridgeview's data look different than mine? Clarity is what saved me, not anger. Anger was there, but I couldn't afford to lead with it. I had to understand the shape of what had happened before I could do anything about it. That's not coldness. That's the most disciplined form of self-respect I know. The third is endurance, not the heroic kind, the ordinary, unglamorous kind, the kind that looks like making one more phone call, reading one more document at 3 a.m., sending one more email to Diane. I didn't feel strong during those 6 weeks. I felt exhausted and frightened and sometimes deeply humiliated. But I kept moving. Not because I was certain it would work out, because stopping felt like agreeing with the lie. What happened to me had a logic to it, even if it was a cruel one. A man with authority protected someone in his circle and used that same authority to silence someone who had none. That is not a supernatural occurrence. It's a pattern as old as institutions themselves. And the only thing that consistently disrupts that pattern is a person who refuses to accept a false account of themselves, quietly, methodically, without losing their compass. Tyler learned to read that spring. I think about that more than I think about the board member's resignation. Some outcomes are worth more than others.